When we talk about warfare in the 21st century, we are no longer talking about battlefields. We are talking about the collapse of societies, the destruction of economies, and the suffering of ordinary people. Russia's latest strike on civilian areas, hospitals, housing blocks, and public infrastructure was not simply an act of aggression. It was a calculated strategy, an economic weapon meant to crush morale. But in the logic of modern conflict, every blow creates its equal and opposite response. Ukraine's sudden counterstrike on Russia's energy grid plunged nearly 1 million Russians into darkness. Entire regions went offline. Factories halted production. Families sat in freezing apartments without light or heat, and in that moment, the war stopped being over there. It came home. What this demonstrates is that war has changed its nature. It's not merely a clash of armies. It's a clash of economies. The grid, the pipelines, the markets, these are the new front lines. When you turn off the lights in Moscow or Belgorod, you're not just disrupting electricity. You're shaking the pillars of a system built on control, hierarchy, and the illusion of stability. The Russian state has presented itself as impenetrable, but Ukraine's strike revealed just how fragile that image really is. The darkness wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. A glimpse into the deep insecurity of a nation that depends on centralized power to maintain order. But we must ask, who pays the price? Because behind every retaliatory act, there are ordinary people. The worker in St. Petersburg who can't run his machine. The mother in Kharkiv who can't find medicine for her child. The pensioner in Moscow sitting by a candle. These are not the oligarchs. These are not the generals. These are the people whose lives are traded like poker chips in a geopolitical casino run by the powerful. And this is the tragedy of economic warfare. Both sides bleed from the same wound. We must also recognize the larger game at play. When Ukraine strikes back with such precision, it's not only about military retaliation, it's about narrative. It's about showing the West that their aid, their intelligence, their weapons are making an impact. And make no mistake, this message isn't just for Moscow, it's for Washington, Brussels, and Berlin. It's saying we are not victims. We can retaliate. And the moment you can retaliate, the dynamics of power shift, the balance changes, the tables turn. But what happens when the lights go out for too long? When energy systems fail? When economies stall? When fear becomes normal? Societies start to crack. People question their leaders. Inflation soars, food prices rise, political legitimacy erodes, and suddenly you don't just have a war between nations, you have a war within nations. You have protest movements, labor strikes, and a public that begins to realize that the cost of power, political, economic, or military, is being paid by those who never had any power to begin with. This is the era of hybrid war, fought not only with missiles, but with information, with markets, with currencies, with supply chains. Russia's hit on civilians was a display of brute force. Ukraine's response cutting power to 1 million was a demonstration of precision, intelligence, and economic strategy. Both are dangerous, both escalate, and both push us closer to a world where destruction of infrastructure becomes the new normal and civilian suffering becomes background noise. So While headlines will speak of revenge, we must see beyond the immediate. We must understand that what's unfolding is a transformation of global power structures, a test of endurance between systems of governance, between centralized authoritarianism and fragmented democracies. And in this tug of war, the victims are not in the Kremlin or the Rada, they're in the dark, waiting for the light to return. When we examine the contemporary theater of war, it becomes painfully clear that traditional battlefields, trenches, tanks, and artillery barrages are no longer the decisive arenas of conflict. The modern struggle is fought not just with bombs and bullets, but with networks, supply chains, power grids, and digital infrastructure. Ukraine's recent retaliation against Russian energy systems illustrates this shift perfectly. By targeting electrical grids and key infrastructure, Ukraine struck not only at the physical apparatus of the state, but at the very foundation of its economic and social order. 1 million Russians plunged into darkness is not merely a statistic. It represents an immediate disruption of labor, production, and consumption. Factories halt, hospitals strain, transportation grids collapse, all manifestations of economic warfare in its most immediate, palpable form. This strategy exploits vulnerabilities inherent in centralized systems. The Kremlin's power depends on tightly controlled networks, from energy distribution to financial gorge transactions. When these systems fail, the ripple effect is swift and catastrophic. The blackout does not just inconvenience citizens, it prevents them from working, shopping, and participating in the economy. Every hour of disruption translates into lost productivity, rising costs, and mounting social tension. Unlike conventional battles, where victory can be declared on a map, in economic warfare, success is measured in delayed production, interrupted supply chains, and the growing discontent of ordinary citizens. It is a war where GDP, industrial output, and civilian morale are as much the targets as soldiers on the front lines. Furthermore, the psychological impact of economic warfare cannot be underestimated. The absence of electricity, the freezing of water systems, the disruption of communications. These are the invisible weapons that amplify fear and uncertainty. They to demonstrate that control over an economy is equivalent to control over society itself. In this sense, modern war extends far beyond the battlefield. It invades homes, workplaces, and everyday routines. The civilians are no longer collateral damage. They are the direct instruments through which the effectiveness of strategy is measured. Ukraine's tactical brilliance in exploiting these economic vulnerabilities is a testament to a broader trend in contemporary conflict. The battlefield is no longer defined by geography or territory. It is defined by systems, networks, and flows of resources. Power is measured not just in tanks or missiles, but in the ability to disrupt, incapacitate, and destabilize an opponent's economic foundations. In this context, electricity, pipelines, and financial networks are as lethal as any artillery, transforming war into a multi-dimensional contest of economic dominance. Ukraine's sudden counterstrike against Russian infrastructure did more than retaliate. It peeled back the layers of an image that the Kremlin has carefully cultivated for decades. Russia has portrayed itself as a fortress, an unassailable state with deep reserves, centralized control, and technological superiority. Yet, when millions of citizens were plunged into darkness, the myth of invulnerability was shattered almost instantly. Energy grids that were assumed to be secure failed under precision strikes. Factories halted, hospitals struggled, and every day life was disrupted on a scale that no propaganda could fully conceal. In that moment, vulnerability became tangible, visible, and impossible to deny. This exposure of weakness is not merely symbolic. It demonstrates the fragility of centralized systems that rely on hierarchical management and top-down control. Russia's energy infrastructure, like much of its economy, is heavily centralized. A single point of failure can ripple outward, affecting millions of people, crippling industrial production, and generating widespread fear. Ukraine's strategy exploited this very structure, showing that modern warfare is as much about understanding an opponent's systemic dependencies as it is about striking military targets. The blackout was not random chaos. It was a calculated disruption designed to reveal exactly where Russia is most vulnerable and where its centralized control can fail. Beyond the immediate physical impact, the blackout sent a message about the limits of authoritarian control. The Russian state depends on the perception of strength to maintain legitimacy, both domestically and internationally. When the lights went out, the illusion of omnipotence faltered. Ordinary Russians, accustomed to stability as a given, were suddenly reminded of the precariousness of their daily lives. In this sense, Ukraine's retaliation did not only hit infrastructure, it targeted confidence, control, and the psychological foundation of authority. Furthermore, the exposure has strategic implications that extend beyond the present conflict. Allies and adversaries alike take note when a supposedly strong state exhibits such clear vulnerabilities. Economic sanctions, military planning, and diplomatic postures are influenced not just by what a nation can do, but by what it cannot withstand. Ukraine's ability to exploit these weaknesses highlights a new paradigm of asymmetric warfare, where smaller or less resourced nations can impose significant costs on a larger power by identifying and striking systemic vulnerabilities. The precision and efficiency of Ukraine's retaliation underscores a fundamental truth about modern conflict. Strength is no longer measured solely by size, territory, or firepower. It is measured by resilience, adaptability, and the capacity to defend systems that sustain society. The blackout revealed not just a tactical failure, but a structural weakness that carries profound consequences for Russia's ability to project power and maintain control. When we analyze modern conflicts, it is impossible to ignore the human cost. And by human cost, I do not mean abstract statistics or casualty reports. I mean the daily reality for ordinary people who live under the shadow of decisions made far above their heads. The Ukrainian counterstrike that plunged millions of Russians into darkness is a stark illustration of this. It was not the generals in Moscow or the oligarchs in their fortified estates who sat shivering in unheated apartments. It was the factory worker whose machinery stopped mid-production, the nurse who struggled to keep life-saving equipment running, the elderly couple who could no longer cook or heat their home. These are the people who pay in real, tangible terms for geopolitical gambits they have no control over. Economic and infrastructure warfare transforms civilians into instruments of strategy. Every power outage, every disrupted supply chain, every frozen bank account is not merely collateral damage, it is a deliberate point of pressure in a system where the cost of conflict is externalized onto the powerless. Ukraine's retaliation was designed to hit Russia strategically, but the immediate victims were the everyday citizens whose lives are intertwined with the functioning of society. Children went without light to study. Workers went without tools to earn their wage. Hospitals scrambled to maintain essential services. And yet, these people rarely appear in headlines. They are reduced to numbers in a report, millions plunged into darkness while the world debates political strategy and military success. This human toll reveals a deeper truth about the nature of modern warfare. Power is rarely exercised in isolation from society. And the consequences of that power almost always cascade down to the least empowered. Governments wage war under the guise of national security, sovereignty, or revenge, but the cost is social, economic, and deeply personal. The moment the lights went out, millions of Russians were forced to confront the fragility of their daily existence, the limits of their state's protection, and the stark reality that decisions made in distant offices can destabilize entire communities overnight. Moreover, the suffering of ordinary people is not confined to a single geographic or national boundary. Economic shocks ripple outward when factories halt, global supply chains are disrupted. When households cannot function, consumption slows, creating further strain on the broader economy. This interconnectedness makes civilians both the first line of impact and the silent witnesses to the profound consequences of political and military decisions. The true cost of war, therefore, is measured not in missiles or maps, but in the disrupted lives, the unmet needs, and the silent suffering of those who had no part in the conflict, yet bear its heaviest burden. In modern conflicts, retaliation is never merely a matter of morality or retribution. It is communication. When Ukraine struck Russia's energy grid, plunging millions into darkness, the act carried a message louder than any official statement or diplomatic note. We are not powerless. We can respond. We can hit back. In this sense, the blackout was more than a military maneuver. It was a deliberate political signal aimed at multiple audiences simultaneously. It demonstrated to Moscow that aggression is met with consequences, to the West that their support has tangible impact, and to the world that Ukraine is a nation capable of strategic precision despite being outmatched in size and resources. Revenge in this context is weaponized as narrative, as proof of competence, resolve, and agency. The power of such a message is rooted in perception. In authoritarian systems like Russia, the legitimacy of leadership relies heavily on the belief that the state is invulnerable, omnipotent, and capable of controlling outcomes. When the lights went out, the carefully constructed narrative of strength faltered. Citizens saw firsthand that their government could be challenged, that systems they relied upon could fail, and that resistance was not futile. This is the dual function of revenge as political messaging. It punishes the aggressor while simultaneously reshaping their citizens' perception of power. Ukraine's strike demonstrated that modern warfare is as much about psychological impact as physical destruction. Furthermore, this act of retaliation sends a signal beyond national borders. International observers, allies, and adversaries take note when a smaller, seemingly vulnerable country can impose significant costs on a larger power. It reframes the conflict in terms of capability rather than mere numbers or territory. The message is clear. Strategy, intelligence, and precision can offset brute force. The act of revenge becomes evidence that smaller actors in global politics can still influence outcomes, challenge dominant powers, and assert agency on the international stage. This is particularly significant in the context of Western support. Weapons, intelligence, and aid are only meaningful if they translate into results. Ukraine's strategic retaliation proved that these resources are effective and that the nation receiving support is not passively waiting for protection, but actively shaping the battlefield. The blackout therefore communicates competence, resilience, and operational sophistication. It reinforces internal morale while sending shockwaves through the opponent's political and social structures. Revenge as a political message is not simply reactive, it is proactive, calculated, and multidimensional. It serves as a tool to influence perception, disrupt confidence, and shift the balance of psychological power, demonstrating that warfare now extends into the realms of narrative legitimacy and the very concept of authority itself. Power outages in modern warfare are far more than inconvenient interruptions. They are catalysts that reshape politics, society, and economic behavior. When Ukraine's counterstrike plunged millions of Russians into darkness, the immediate effect was material. No electricity, no heat, stalled transportation, disrupted communication. But the deeper, more consequential effect is political. Outages like these expose the fragility of state infrastructure and force citizens to confront the limitations of governmental control. When the systems that uphold everyday life falter, trust erodes, and ordinary people begin to question the competence and legitimacy of their leaders. In this sense, an electricity blackout becomes a tool of political pressure, a mechanism through which systemic weaknesses are revealed and social dynamics are altered. The impact of power outages extends beyond mere discomfort. Factories cannot operate, commercial activity stalls, and essential services such as hospitals, water treatment plants, and public transportation are severely impaired. Economic stagnation follows immediately, creating a cascade of consequences that touch every layer of society. Citizens who once assumed that their government could guarantee stability are confronted with uncertainty, fear, and the tangible consequences of systemic vulnerability. The moment the lights go out, the implicit social contract between state and society is called into question. If the state cannot protect the infrastructure that sustains daily life, how can it be trusted to defend against external threats? Furthermore, extended outages catalyze social and political unrest. When the basic conditions of life are disrupted, heating in winter, access to medical care, functioning commerce, citizens are more likely to protest, strike, or resist in ways that they might not during normal times. Even small disruptions repeated over time can erode the legitimacy of centralized authority, empowering opposition groups, independent activists, and civil society organizations to challenge the ruling regime. The Ukraine's strategic targeting of energy systems therefore functions not only as a military maneuver, but as a calculated political intervention, using disruption to destabilize the opponent internally while asserting strength externally. Power outages also communicate to international observers the vulnerability of the targeted state. Allies, adversaries, and neutral nations alike take note when a central power fails to maintain essential services. In global politics, perception of competence matters as much as actual military might. By demonstrating that even a seemingly strong state can be destabilized through infrastructure disruption, Ukraine's actions shift both domestic and international calculations, highlighting the ways in which control over energy and technology translates directly into political influence and authority. The concept of hybrid warfare has redefined the nature of conflict in the 21st century. No longer confined to armies, tanks, or airstrikes, modern war encompasses economic disruption, cyber attacks, information manipulation, and infrastructure sabotage. Ukraine's precision strike on Russian energy grids exemplifies this evolution. By targeting the electrical network, Ukraine demonstrated that the most effective weapons are not always missiles, but intelligence, planning, and the ability to exploit systemic weaknesses. Hybrid warfare transforms the battlefield into a multi-dimensional space where physical, economic, and psychological factors intersect, and where civilian populations, industrial networks, and digital systems become central to strategy rather than mere collateral. Hybrid warfare relies on the integration of multiple tools to achieve strategic objectives without necessarily engaging in total conventional confrontation. Cyber attacks can freeze financial systems. Disinformation campaigns can erode public trust. Infrastructure sabotage can halt production and disrupt daily life. And targeted military strikes can combine with these elements to amplify their impact. Ukraine's energy grid strike illustrates the interplay between physical and psychological impact. By turning off power for millions of Russians, the Ukrainian forces created fear, uncertainty, and social disruption while simultaneously demonstrating operational capability and strategic intelligence. In hybrid warfare, perception is as crucial as reality. The ability to project strength, disrupt systems, and influence behavior often outweighs territorial gains or the destruction of traditional military assets. Hybrid warfare also highlights the asymmetry in contemporary conflicts. Smaller or less resourced nations can inflict disproportionate damage by exploiting vulnerabilities in larger, seemingly dominant powers. Conventional superiority, more tanks, more soldiers, more missiles becomes less decisive when adversaries can target critical nodes within a society's economic, technological, and communication networks. Ukraine's precise retaliation underscores this point. It is not the size of the nation, but the sophistication of strategy, the exploitation of systemic weaknesses, and the capacity for resilience that determine influence in the modern battlefield. Moreover, hybrid warfare blurs the line between war and daily life. Civilians are no longer distant observers, they are integral components of strategic calculations. Factories, hospitals, and homes all become arenas where conflicts unfold, whether through disrupted services, power outages, or cyber-induced chaos. Governments are forced to defend not only their borders, but the systems that sustain society, from electrical grids to banking networks. The battlefield expands beyond geographic constraints, integrating economic, technological, and social dimensions into a single interdependent arena. Hybrid warfare is therefore a transformative force. It redefines power, reshapes strategy, and forces nations to confront vulnerabilities that traditional military thinking often overlooks. In this new paradigm, warfare is systemic, multidimensional, and inescapably tied to the functioning of society itself.